Welcome to Week, the political roundtable from the Commonwealth Club of California, presented this month in partnership with our friends at the Capitol Club. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for a special election conversation about the people, propositions, and policies on the ballot this fall. I'm John Zipper, your host for the Week Political Roundtable and the Commonwealth Club's Vice President of Media and Editorial. On today's program, we are going to have a special focus on the 12 statewide propositions before voters, and we will do what we can to help you be informed about them as you look at your ballot. And as we always do on Week to Week, we will also talk about some of the other hot button issues on the political scene. And before you even ask, yes, it's been difficult to choose what we will discuss. When just the past couple of weeks, we've had a Trump tax dump, we've had rapid COVID spread, we've had a presidential COVID infection, we've had a debate debacle, a Kimberly Guilfoyle scandal, failed stimulus talks in DC, and now we have another story that will rock this nation. It's the proliferation of super pigs, 9 million feral pigs that are running amok across the country. And I'm not making this up, they're being called a feral swine bomb. And there are understandable fears that they will use the vote by mail system to undermine the election. Now, they're even invading Canada, building what's called pigloos as they move north. And they're accomplishing an invasion of our northern neighbor that the United States itself was incapable of pulling off successfully in the War of 1812. So we don't even have time to get into that in this program. We'll do a separate one where we get into super pigs and murder hornets, maybe. But for today's program, if you're watching us live on Facebook or YouTube, use the chat functions on either one of those to send in questions, and I'll try to work them into our conversation with our panelists today. And we do have a lot to discuss, so let's get started by meeting our panelists. They are all political experts and week-to-week veterans, so I'm pleased to welcome them back to our virtual stage. Let's start with Dr. Lanhee Chen. He is the David and Diane Steffy Fellow in American Public Policy Studies at Hoover Institution. He's also the Director of Domestic Policy Studies for the Public Policy Program at Stanford University, and he's on Twitter at Lanhee Chen. Lanhee, good to see you again.
Thank you, John.
Dr. Larry Gersten is a political analyst for NBC Bay Area. He's also Professor Emeritus of Political Science at San Jose State University and the author of a number of books in California politics, as well as 2 children's books. He's on Twitter at L. Gersten. Larry, good to see you.
Great to be with you.
And Carla Marinucci is the senior writer for the Politico California Playbook. You can follow her and all that she follows on Twitter at C. Marinucci. Carla, great to see you back.
Good to be here. Thanks.
Now, first, I wanted to get into the propositions because there are a lot of them. Some of them might be kind of minor. Others are really interesting, and there's a lot of controversy about some of them. So let's get into them. If you're like me and you consider yourself reasonably politically informed, it's likely you're surprised by some of the propositions when you open your ballot. Now, I literally received mine yesterday, and I will be filling it out later today and sending it in. I guess you can put it in a Dropbox, you can put it in the mail, or if you're from my home state of Wisconsin, I guess you can just leave it in a ditch somewhere and someone finds it. But let's talk about each proposition. And if you want to get a refresher for any of these when you later sit down with your ballots, you can check out some guides to the propositions at calmatters.org or Politico California Playbook has a great refresher on them. So the first ballot measure is Proposition 14. And this issues $5.5 billion in bonds for the state's Stem Cell Research Institute. Lanhee, didn't we do this a while ago?
We did. We actually did several years ago. The original amount that was approved is winding down. So this proposition has been proposed to borrow essentially more money to continue financing of the institute. Look, I think broadly speaking, Californians like the idea of biomedical research. They like the idea of stem cell research. Some of the trickier issues around embryonic research, et cetera, have been mitigated and obviated by science, quite frankly, since then. There is some question about whether we want to be borrowing more money, whether, in fact, California needs to do this because a lot of federal money comes to California already. The opposition, the California Republican Party, as an example, has come out opposed to Prop 14. I was part of those deliberations. In part, I think the big set of conversations was really around this question of borrowing more money. And so I think fiscal hawks, to the extent that any still exist, will take issue with Prop 14. But otherwise, I think stem cell research is broadly quite popular in our state.
Carla, the states and certain institutions really got involved in funding or setting up or protecting stem cell research back when it was, I guess, federal stem cell funding was banned, I believe, under the Bush administration. Right. That's not the case anymore, right? I mean, is there a need for states to be doing this? I mean,
I think particularly when you're talking about the COVID pandemic, some of the drugs being talked about are the result of stem cell research, and I think you're looking at an issue that is front and center to a lot of people right now. This proposition has been weighted, $8.5 million spent in favor of this one, hardly any money spent against it. So at this point, this appears to be kind of an issue that is absolutely in front of the voters, and it looks weighted and to be going for passage. But the stem cell area right now, top of mind with the pandemic.
Larry, this, as we mentioned, I mean, this is the kind of the second go around on this. Is this something that every few years we're going to be getting bonds for stem cell research?
Well, when they run out of money, they're going to come back for more. The question is, I think in some people's eyes, what are they getting for the money that's been spent? Some people have been critical of this, of the Institute for spending the money in a top-heavy kind of way. And I don't know, when something like this is so low in terms of all the other issues, sometimes it sneaks through, but sometimes people say, I don't know much about it. And experience suggests that when people don't know much about it, they vote no. So given the lack of, look, it's a prisoner in a sense that so many other ballot propositions are crowding this one out. And so for that reason, I'm not at all sure it's going to pass. It may well, but I don't see a lot of movement one way or the other, which makes me cautious.
Okay.
John, can I just add one thing? I think Larry raises a great point there, which is if you look at the public polling on these initiatives in general, not just 14, if there is not an overwhelming majority defined as, let's say, 65% or greater who are going to be voting yes, it's very dicey that initiative actually passes. To Larry's point, the status quo is, why am I in favor of this? Why am I doing this? Unless it is something quite compelling, people tend to vote no. And I think that's a dynamic to watch for as you see polling come out over the next couple of weeks leading into the election. Even if you see an initiative ahead, let's say 55-45, that initiative probably fails on election day.
I mean, I tend to have a reaction on a number of these, and I'm not trying to be funny, where literally I read them and sometimes I think, why are we voting on this?
Yeah.
Surely Sacramento can do this. Surely we don't, it seems very special interested. Well, let's get into these more then, because I'm sure we'll come across a couple of those. Now, Proposition 15, a very uncontroversial topic, right? It's taxes. This would require commercial and industrial properties to be taxed based on market value. I'm going to stick with you, Lanhi. This is a partial changing of Proposition 13, isn't it? This is like
it is. It's something called split roll, which would essentially it would erode some of the Proposition 13 protections around limiting property tax increases. So the history here is in 1978, California voters passed Prop 13. It's sort of a tenet of taxation in California that limits the increase of taxation on property to no more, I think, than 2% per year, unless the property is sold, in which case it's reassessed and the tax basis is reset. This would essentially erode the I'm giving you my editorialized version of what it would do. I'm sure others will have different views, but I think what it would do would erode that protection, which has been overwhelmingly passed and reaffirmed by voters over and over again, but would essentially erode that protection with respect to commercial properties, and does, in my mind, begin to eat away at some of these Proposition 13 protections that I think California taxpayers have spoken again and again in favor of. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, because obviously the play here is trying to figure out a way to make the proposition seem favorable by saying, look, we'll raise more money, we'll be able to do it in a way that doesn't hurt people. But obviously there are consequences to reassessments or limiting the protections for commercial properties. So I think that's the big concern. And this is something that I know a lot of more conservative interests in the state, to the extent that there are any, have been quite aggressively against.
Larry, what do you think the prospects are for this proposition now?
This is a good one. It's good because, on the one hand, people love Prop 13. It's just baked in. I mean, it's like, motherhood, apple pie, and Prop 13. I'm not even sure it's that order. And for that reason, there's such a preponderance to support it. Homeowners are happy with it, and because they feel safe. And so I think some of them may be thinking, well, if they're changing this now for commercial purposes, are they coming after us next? On the other hand, we're talking about revenue increases in a state that desperately needs revenue, particularly because of the billions of dollars that have been left out due to the recession brought on by COVID-19. That's hurt the state. That's hurt local governments. This would produce anywhere between $8 and $12.5 billion a year. So the question is, are people feeling the need to get that money, especially for schools, and jeopardize their future, perhaps? Or do they say, stick with the status quo? I can't give you a clue on this one. I think it's going to be fascinating to see what happens.
Carla?
John, John, this has been the big political battle, I think, on the ballot. On one side, you had the teachers' unions, you have big labor groups, you have the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and you have many of the big city mayors, including London Breed and Eric Garcetti, for this, saying this is the time to revise the assessment on commercial properties like Disneyland, like the Bank of America building, which of which Trump has an interest in. Those haven't been reassessed since 1978. On the other hand, the California Business Roundtable will point out that if those big landlords, those major businesses, start getting tax increases in the millions of dollars, they're going to pass those tax increases on to small business people. So this is a down and dirty fight, and $50 million has been spent for it. But as Lonnie pointed out, the polls show right now about 51% of the voters for this. That's a very small margin right now. If the argument is, do you want to raise taxes in a pandemic? Trying to get that larger story out there about how it would, some of the smaller properties would be protected, but this is the drama, I think, on the ballot this year.
Okay, well, Proposition 16 takes another hot button issue, and that's affirmative action. Larry, give us some history on this. This is like a quarter century rebound from legislation in 96. Is that correct?
It's 96. It was Proposition 209. It basically declared that we would not practice the concept of affirmative action in California. It was a trendsetter of sorts at the time, and the state went for it. Now, bear in mind that the demography in 1996 is so different than the demography now. We're so much more diverse. The question is, how does it play for these various minorities? We know that when affirmative action was banned, so to speak, that some groups were able to gain admission into the universities and state colleges, state universities, because they no longer were limited to any particular number or percentage. Asian Americans benefited great from this. Other groups did not. Other groups that might have been admitted before with affirmative action were no longer admitted to the extent that they were earlier. And it's interesting, I think, that that's where the biggest opposition comes in on this thing, because they've done so well, Asian Americans, in getting into the UC system, thanks to getting rid of what they view is an arbitrary set of standards. Again, these are so hard to predict how they will go, because we know when a strong opposition emerges with any proposition, even if it tends to be a small group, it somehow is magnified, and it gives people reason to think twice. Well, I think it was a good idea, but maybe it isn't. So And I've seen two polls, and I'm sure Lonnie and Carla have seen them too, that showing already being defeated.
Yeah.
Already being defeated by about 10, 15 points. So the proponents have a long way to go, even though I think most people would have thought ahead of time that it's a no-brainer. Go figure. There you have it.
Well, Lonnie, I guess just toss it to you. I mean, what do you make of its prospects, and is this the kind of thing we're going to keep seeing? Say it fails, is this the kind of thing we'll keep seeing kind of brought back?
Yeah, I do think we will continue to see it. Look, what has struck me, I think Larry is absolutely right. There is a very organized constituency in opposition to this. I haven't seen a lot of financial investment in the pro side. It's not clear to me that there's a business interest or a strong interest willing to kind of come in favor, in which case I do think it fails. Look, I think broadly speaking, the way you see this depends on how you frame the argument. And so in my view, if the question is, does the state want to reinstate racial preferences, that becomes a lot less appealing in a lot of ways to people than framing it in terms of, potentially increasing opportunity. I do think one interesting statistic, I actually looked at this data a few years ago and have a piece coming on this shortly. As a percentage of overall high school graduates in California, the percentage of Hispanics in the UC systems actually increased since the UC system got rid of preferences in 1996. The population of Black students has remained roughly equivalent, and the proportion of Asian American students has increased. But it's interesting, right? Because you would think of it in the context of kind of everything we've been seeing, especially with the racial reckoning that's happened around the country. You would think this is the perfect time and perfect environment for something like this to pass. But I don't think it will, A, because of the organized opposition, and B, because I do think when the debate is cast in terms of reinstating racial preferences that have the potential to divide us, it becomes less popular.
I think we've got a couple here that we can go through fairly quickly. I mean, Proposition 17 involves giving the right to vote to people, felons who are on parole. I can speak more clearly, I guess. What are the pros and cons of this one? Carla, why don't we start with you?
I mean, this is one supported by the ACLU, the League of Women Voters. The idea that the California voters have already given individuals who committed felonies the right to vote, but only after their parole is completed. And so, the reformers say denying them the right to vote is punitive. It affects Blacks and Latinos overwhelmingly. And so what this measure would do would basically restore voting rights to about 40,000 who have been released from prison, but who are still on parole. And I think that, right, you're once again a split, I think a partisan split on this one. Senator Jim Nielsen being one of the ones who are saying no on this, that these parolees or these folks released from jail should not have the right to vote, should not regain the right to vote. So I think that's it's pretty cut and dried on this one. Right now, about $1 million has been spent for it, and no money has been spent against it. So that may be an indication of where it might go.
Lonnie, I mean, 40,000 people out of a state with 40-something million people doesn't sound like a lot. And even with those votes restored, those voting rights, what percentage of them, do we even know how many likely votes we're actually talking about here? Is this something?
The numbers aren't big. I think it ends up being a question of principle, which is if you think that folks have done their time, does that time extend to their time on parole or not? That's really the question. If you believe it does, then you're going to be against the notion of giving them the opportunity to vote while they're completing their parole. And if you think, look, parole is not time incarceration, then you're going to vote the other way. This really does fall. I think, as Carla noted, this is going to go pretty closely with one's views on criminal justice issues more broadly.
Larry, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with Lonnie. It's values here, principles. Look, I think you're going to see a lot of conservatives against this on principle. And don't be surprised if you see a lot of Central Valley moderates go against this as well. I don't think this is a slam dunk necessarily. Like a lot of things, people read it. Well, wait a second. Have they really done their time? They're on parole because we're not sure. So I'm not so sure this is going to be a slam dunk. I think there's a legitimate argument that's going to be much more prevalent than just among traditional law and order types in the Republican Party. I think it's going to overlap into independents and a lot of moderate Democrats who feel in a lot of ways pushed around by the liberals. People forget the Democratic Party is hardly a monolithic body in this state. So I think we have to watch for that.
Okay, well, what about the very next proposition, which is Proposition 18? This involves allowing 17-year-olds who will be 18 years old by the time of the general election. It would allow them to vote in the primary and, I guess, special elections beforehand. Larry, I mean, what's the breakdown of this? And again, young people tend not to vote anyway. What do you get out of it?
You're talking about both of them. I think this has a good shot of slipping through because the time of the vote, the time that they could vote for the general election, it'd have to be 18. There's a proposition on the ballot in San Francisco that allows 16 and 17-year-olds to vote in municipal questions. You probably know about this, John. And that one, I think, has a lot more meat to it in terms of whether you want to allow kids to do that. But this one, in some ways, is in California, nothing's a no-brainer. But I think this gets as close to being a no-brainer as it can be. Really not a lot of controversy there from my perspective.
You agree, Lonnie?
I mean, yes, I think this is one of those where you sort of scratch your head and think we're really voting on this one this year. We mentioned that earlier. I mean, look, I think there's a strong argument to be made that if voters are going to be eligible in the fall election, they ought to be eligible potentially in the election a few months before. I think the challenge is, I mean, in the raw politics of this, what is introducing a bunch of 17-year-olds to the electorate going to mean for the primary elections, which are top two in this state? They are not partisan primaries. What is that going to mean to the ability, for example, of Republicans to be more competitive, given that young people tend to disproportionately vote Democrat? So there are those political dynamics at play. But certainly, there's also a question about how many people we're talking about here, right? This is the same question as the parolees, which is how big of a universe and how much will it actually impact the elections? In close races on the margins, there could be an impact. But broadly speaking, I think the impact is relatively muted.
Carla?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think, look, Alex Padilla is for this one, the Secretary of State. I think Democrats say younger voters tend to be more Democratic voters. And I think that's why it's being pushed. As Larry said, not many of them, but more likely to lean Democratic. I think that's why it's a favorite of Democratic officials right now. Absolutely.
Sure. Well, then quickly, I guess, on Proposition 19, this involves some changes in real estate tax assessment transfers and inheritance rules. Lonnie, as far as I can tell, this would hike taxes on inherited homes in order to give a tax break on Californians 55-year-old or older when they buy a new home. What's the thinking here?
Yeah, this is a complex menagerie of changes to Prop 13 that really was an effort to try and pair something that would be perceived as enticing to conservatives with something that'd be enticing for others. I'll say this is the one proposition that the Republican Party of California was unable to arrive at a recommendation on, because there were people sort of on both sides of this. And the basic idea is you would allow folks who are older, over the age of 55, to transfer the basis in their home that's been accumulated over many years under Prop 13 to any county in California. Right now, they can only transfer it to 10 counties in California, including some of the bigger ones, Alameda, LA, Santa Clara, et cetera. But the idea is you can take now that money and transfer it, the basis you've accumulated in your home, and transfer it to another home, even a more expensive one. And at the same time, it would essentially prohibit the favorable tax treatment from going to those who use it to pass on homes that are not primary residences. In other words, if I've got a secondary home or a home that I'm going to pass on to my kids and they're going to use it on Airbnb or VRBO to make money, they should not have the benefit of that tax advantage. And so the idea was that tax increase coupled with the portability that I mentioned earlier, the idea was this alliance could create enough support to get it across the finish line. Look, the proposition's being heavily supported by the realtors. They believe this is going to free up housing stock and obviously help them to turn over more homes because people are not going to be hanging onto these houses for longer. It's a really tough one. It's confusing. And for that reason, I think people just say, forget it. Why are we making these changes? Forget it. I don't know what the polling is like, but if I had to guess, this thing does not pass.
But John, I can tell you how this one is played in my household because, I think it's popular with boomers or 55 and over. That means you can, if I've owned my house for 30 years, I can take that same low tax rate anywhere in California. However, my millennial kids have said, hey, you boomers have already gotten enough benefits here. That's why we can't afford any homes. I think this it's really interesting how this has been portrayed on the tube. The ads stress people who have been hurt by wildfires, who need the tax break to relocate someplace, or the disabled. That's how it's being sold in the ad campaigns. So I think it's going to be interesting to watch. I also think the end of that loophole, that Hollywood loophole, there's been a number of investigative stories about rich Hollywood families passing on to their kids, and they end up Airbnb the homes. I think that's maybe a benefit, but you're right. It's a very complicated initiative, and for that reason, chancy maybe.
Larry, what are your thoughts? Is it too complicated for folks?
Yeah, it is. It's too complicated. It's too confusing. I had to read it about 10 times, get it translated into 4 different languages. I mean, it was just, it was just awful. And I mean, if people who are in the business have a hard time with it, what's it going to be like? And remember the rule of thumb, if it's complicated, it's confusing, it's no. It's that easy. And if I were pushing this initiative, I would have done it entirely differently. I would have said, look, this is the idea of taking your equity, your base, and moving it to another house, is done already in whatever it is, 12 or 14 counties. All we're trying to do is equalize things for people. That's how I would have pushed this. Because if it's already there, why don't we make it there for everybody? Now, of course, it's not exactly all of that, but it's a good deal of it. But for whatever reason, the proponents took a complicated initiative and decided to give complicated arguments, and you're going to find a complicated no at the end.
Okay, well, Carla, Proposition 20, this involves kind of redressing some aspects of Proposition 47 and I believe 57, where certain felonies were made misdemeanors. This would make some misdemeanors felonies again, and some other changes. I can't count how many times I have been in a Walgreens or a grocery store and seen someone walk in, grab stuff, and just walk out. And the people working there are just like, we can't do anything. And if the police show up, they can't and won't do anything. And if they do something, the worst that happens is the person gets a fine, which they never pay.
Right.
And so you hear that echo through, and I've heard it from police, I've heard it from store owners, I've heard it from other people. Do you think this could capture that kind of anger and become law, or do you think it's? Yeah,
and I think this is one case where a lot of Republicans have worked very hard on this one with regard to the pro side. I just heard Devin Nunes yesterday. He's been campaigning relentlessly for this one as a law and order issue. That is a lot of law enforcement unions, California Police Chiefs Association, and others are arguing that Prop 47 and Prop 57, which of course downgraded a lot of crimes, which have been, some folks have said the result has been more car break-ins, et cetera, more home break-ins, that this rolls back some of those changes and expands the list of crimes and gets tough again on supervision of parolees and other areas. So this is being portrayed by many Republicans as a law and order proposition. And I think, this is one that, again, $6.3 million has been spent against, but this may resonate with some folks out there, whether you're talking about, home break-ins, car break-ins, that hits home to a lot of people. I'm not sure where the polls are at on it, though.
Larry, what are your thoughts?
only 1 out of 3 statewide ballot propositions ever becomes law. And some of these on the ballot are perfectly good reasons as to why. You said earlier, some of these things should be done by the legislature. And I don't know about any of you, but when I go around, I'm in the business, as I think a lot of us are, of trying to explain these things to people and say, well, what does this mean? Tell me what it's about. And by the time I get through about the 3rd paragraph, they're sleeping. I mean, this is the kind of thing that leaves people totally flummoxed and asking John the same thing you just said early on. Why aren't these things done by the legislature? They may make perfectly good sense. We all seen those commercials, there's something wrong here, but I'm not sure it's going to pass the smell test in terms of people understanding it well enough to vote, even if it does make sense in terms of correcting some of the wrongs.
Okay, Lonnie, what do you think?
I don't have a whole lot to add to that. I mean, I think you're going to see this one very similarly through the lens of the one we talked about earlier in terms of voting rights for parolees. It does become a criminal justice question. How you see that broad set of issues and your orientation is going to drive how you vote on this particular one. But certainly, everyone in California, particularly those who live in the Bay Area, are familiar with some of the challenges that we've seen with rising petty theft and crime. And to the extent that this proposition taps into that, I think it could be successful.
Okay. I don't know if you could hear that. Someone's ringing my doorbell. Proposition 21. Now, this is another one of those zombie things that just keeps coming back. This regards rent control in the state. And according to Carla's friends at Politico, basically this is a proposition that was pushed by many of the same people in 2018. In 2019, the legislature had failed. Carla, why doesn't this zombie die?
This is, I think, the question here that a lot of people are going to be asking is like, why are we at this again? A similar initiative failed in 2018. And as we know, I mean, the legislature and Governor Newsom have passed a deal that basically curtails rent increases. But the AIDS Healthcare Foundation is almost entirely funding. That Michael Weinstein is almost entirely funding this one on the argument that what Newsom and the legislature did not go far enough. This would allow those local governments to really impose a much broader rent control. Basically goes back to the 1994 Costa-Hawkins Act. So, at this point with the housing crisis front and center, perhaps this is going to get some traction, but it has not passed the voters' muster before. And yet here we are 2 years later going at it again.
Larry, I'm going to ask you to go. I'm going to go let in a very insistent person. I'm going to come right back. So just pretend I'm here. What's your thoughts?
If this passes, I think it'll pass because we have a changing electorate. The electorate in 2018 is not the same electorate as 2020. You've got a lot more renters coming out in 2020 than you had in 2018. You've got a lot more younger people coming out in 2020 than you had in 2018. The demography is such that this year is much different for those reasons. I think it's an uphill battle because, as you said, Carla, we've been there, done that. But given a different electorate and given the anger that people have over this issue, I think it's got a shot. Just because of those changes.
Lonnie, your thoughts?
Yeah, the composition of the electorate matters a lot, and I agree with Larry that I think this electorate's going to be different than the one we saw in 18. Look, we know what the arguments are for and against rent control. It's a pretty heavily debated issue in municipalities as well as statewide here in California. But we'll see. It entirely depends on who shows up on election day and before via the mail-in vote.
Okay, well, let's move on to one that is very contentious and has a lot of money that's been spent on it. This is Proposition 22, and this is kind of a follow-on to AB 5, which was a bill that required a lot of companies, for-profit and nonprofit, to reclassify contractors as employees. And this has led to a lot of paperwork. Some contractors have lost contracts. Some expense has been involved for these organizations, these companies. Larry, this is kind of called the Uber Lyft proposition. It's heavily backed by them. Is this the best way for them to get redressed for what they disagree with in the legislation, or would the legislature be the appropriate place to deal with something like this?
Well, actually, John, they lost in the legislature. That's why they've come here. That's why they're doing. This is why people who lose in the legislature go to the proposition process. Okay, we lost there. We're going to try it here. It's a fascinating proposition because there's so much at stake, not only for the rideshare companies, but also for the drivers. And more than that, organized labor. We're talking about 100,000 people. Organized labor says to themselves, wow, what an opportunity we have here to organize these people. The drivers say that the labor says, I should say, the drivers make after expenses $6 an hour. The rideshare companies say they make between $25 and $27 an hour. What do you do with that? Well, I just averaged them. Okay, so you average it out, and they're making $16.50 an hour. Simple math. But that's just barely above minimum wage. So the question is, are people going to make that kind of a connection? And I think we're also thinking about their self-interest here. How many people use these things and don't want to see their prices go up, versus how many people feel that these drivers need a better break in terms of not only salary but benefits and whatnot? It's a good one. It's going to have the most amount of money, I believe, of all the propositions this time around, and it'll be fascinating to see how it turns out.
Lonnie, I mean, can these companies exist if they need to pay, salaries and benefits for all of their contractors now who would then become employees?
Yeah. Well, they've argued that they won't be able to exist, and I think you've heard that argument made by certainly Uber and Lyft, both of which were on the precipice of halting services in California because of the requirements put in place by AB5. Look, however well-intentioned, I do think AB5 is a problem fundamentally for the business models of companies like Lyft and DoorDash and Uber and et cetera, that rely on flexible labor laws to both to provide opportunity to drivers, but also to make their platforms financially successful as well. And, Prop 22 is interesting because, yes, it does reclassify certain app-based drivers out of the AB5 schematic, but it also calls for some increased rights for drivers as well, right? Putting in place additional requirements that the companies provide insurance, both accidental insurance as well as auto insurance, additional benefits if a certain number of hours are worked. So there's an effort here to try to get at that middle ground. But in my mind, the thing that AB5, the reason why AB5 was so misguided in many ways was because it inhibited the ability of flexible arrangements that have benefited so many Californians. And I think if you look at the certainly overwhelming number of drivers and others who I talk to who value the opportunity to hop on and get a little bit of extra income when they can, the fact that AB5 threatens that, I think is a real challenge. So, look, I'm on record in favor of 22. I think it's a very important thing to do. We'll see what happens. There's a lot of money being spent, obviously, on both sides of this. So hopefully the voters will be able to cut through and get to the issues at hand.
Carla, we mentioned the millions and millions that have been spent on this. Are they getting their money's worth?
190 million, Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, that's what they've spent versus 14 million for the other side. And those are labor interests, as you said, and it is going to be interesting. As Lonnie said, I've talked to a number of Uber drivers who said, no, I don't want to be an employee. I want that flexibility. On the other hand, you got a lot of the labor unions are saying, look, these workers deserve the right to, a health insurance stipend, some protection from the job injuries, a guaranteed minimum wage, et cetera, particularly in this, again, COVID era. So I think whether they've gotten their money's worth, this is sort of the 800-pound gorilla on the ballot in terms of spending. And it's going to be very consequential and watched all over the country how this one turns out.
And for any of you, do we know anything on the polling about this one?
I haven't seen anything.
I haven't seen it lately, no.
No, then people will definitely be watching that one. The next proposition is a smaller one, and it is literally one I wrote in my notes. Why are state voters being forced to decide this? This is Proposition 23 that requires a physician to be on site at dialysis clinics and consent from the state for a clinic to close. I asked that question of why are we having to vote on this with no intention of throwing shade at either the proponents or opponents of this. It's simply, this seems like a really arcane thing for state voters who, of course, will know nothing. I certainly know nothing about the proper way to run a dialysis clinic. I will literally say I am unqualified to vote on this. So you guys tell me how I should vote. Lanhi?
Well, this is a rehash of a fight that occurred a few years ago about staffing in dialysis clinics. And, it's a fight between labor and dialysis clinic operators. It's really the best way to think of it. The Prop 23 would require a physician to be on site at a dialysis clinic at all times, in case something happens. And if they're not available to essentially to have another sort of similarly qualified person there, the idea obviously is it would boost potentially nursing or the presence of nurses, which the nurses unions have been supportive of. And in opposition, dialysis clinics say, look, why do we want to take critical personnel away from hospitals and places where they're actually needed and put them into dialysis clinics where very rarely do you see problems arise that require this sort of immediate attention? So that's the fight. I imagine most voters this will be a head scratcher for most. And as we've noted earlier, unless there's a strong, compelling reason to be for it, they probably vote against it. And I think that probably at the end of the day is the right vote, but it's a head scratcher for sure. Again, so many of these propositions, by the way, and I'm sure Larry and Carla would agree, it's like the same battles over and over and over again. And you try and tweak it a little bit to make it a little bit more appealing. But by so doing, you create additional constituencies that might oppose you. This is just what our initiative process has become in California. I think it's broken. And I think we got to figure out some way of fixing it. The process, not dialysis clinics, by the way.
Larry, do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, it's narrow interest. This is sort of like back to 22, back to several of them. When they don't get what they want in the legislature, they come back through the initiative process, and it's costly and it's wearing on voters. Believe you me, when you talk about the initiative process is broken. Frankly, I think it's been broken since it was initiated. I think it's never worked well. But yet it doesn't matter. They come at people again because these interests think it's their only way. Frankly, I think a better way to deal with these things is to go back to the legislature and say, okay, what can we do to make you happy? Enough different, pull together enough coalition, if you will, to push things through. Legislatures are very responsive to those kinds of things. So nobody's going to know much about it. And the likelihood is, regardless of how any of us feels, it will be defeated simply because this isn't my fight. That's what people will be saying, I think.
Carla, you're nodding.
I mean, not much to add. 10-1 spending against this by the clinics. And I agree. This is one of those propositions that makes voters throw up their hands and say, why am I doing this? I agree on all of the above with what Lonnie and Larry said on this one.
Okay, well, we're almost done with the propositions. Just two more to go. One of them might fall in the exact same category. See how quickly we can get through. Proposition 24, which deals with changing privacy protections in the state. Lanhi opponents of the bill include the ACLU and Dolores Huerta, who are not exactly known as tools of big business. Is this just another one of these special interests? I mean, it's being pushed by this one person who feels very strongly about it.
Yeah. Well, what Prop 24 would do is California already has a privacy law. It's actually, pretty stringent in a lot of ways. But the goal of Prop 24 is to sync up California law with a standard known as GDPR, which is universal across the European Union and has been quite frankly a headache for a lot of American companies to comply with. Any American company that does business in Europe or has any presence in Europe has to comply with the European privacy standard. And the goal is to bring the European privacy standard standard to California. Here again, it's not quite clear to me that, now look, I think every voter likes the idea of data privacy. They want their data to be kept private, but when they really look at it and realize California already has something like this, why are we messing around with this? My sense is it's not going to have a lot of sympathy, and in fact will create headaches not only for California businesses, but also for California consumers in a lot of ways too.
Larry, do you agree?
Voters are conservative with a small c by nature. Why do I need to make something different? What is compelling me to say yes? They're not going to be compelled to say yes on this kind of issue, as well as 5 or 6 of the others that we've talked about. They may be worthy. I'm not suggesting they're not. I'm only suggesting that for most voters to say yes to something, they have to identify with it and really say, I need to see change. I doubt that you're going to see that with this one.
And Carla, this is not a big spending proposition. It's probably one a lot of people won't have heard of, except for our viewers, before they see their ballot.
Yeah, I think that one of the interesting things is, aside from Alistair McTaggart, who was the driver on what has been California's one of the strongest privacy laws, consumer privacy laws in the nation here in California, you also have Andrew Yang behind this one. But as Larry said, a lot of people might just say, why do we need more here? It establishes a state agency that will be enforcing these privacy laws, but I'm not sure that's a big driver for a lot of voters either. So I think that's where this one stands in. It'll be interesting to see how it turns out. That's again, almost 10 times the amount of money spent against this one than for it.
Oh, okay. So the final statewide proposition, if you're still awake, would ban cash bail in the state. This is kind of a follow-up to, I guess, legislation that did this in 2018 in the state, but that, of course, has been tied up in court. Larry, what can you tell us about this proposition and its prospects? Well,
the bail industry, of course, has the most at stake here. And they've been upset about the way that the legislature and the courts have turned things to a point where bail is no longer really as automatic as it used to be, especially given the discretion that judges now have. So the question is there any way for them to return to that kind of system that we had before? It's a small sector, but it's been relatively successful in the past in assuring that state policies work well when it comes to criminality and protecting us from those accused. I'm not sure they're going to have a whole lot of success with this in whatever they do. I think our minds have been made up on this direction already.
Lanhi, and there are, as we mentioned, I mean, the bail industry opposes this, but there also the state NAACP, Human Rights Watch also oppose it. Do you think it's doomed to failure?
Yeah, I mean, I think this falls into the same category. But look, I think the transition that California made from a money bail system to a system where bail, where it's determined essentially by an algorithm that looks at the individuals, a complex set of factors, individuals' past, et cetera, the crime alleged, the fundamental thing that supporters of money bail argue is that, money bail worked. It compelled criminal defendants to appear at trial. The failure rate on bail was something below 2% on money bail. So that's the argument. Whether it's going to be compelling enough to get voters across the finish line to affirmatively check yes, that I have questions about. And now, as I understand it, the yes means to restore money bail, and the no means to keep in place the current system. And that's why I think the current system probably wins at the end of the day, because I think the momentum carries people across the finish line to just saying, no, why do we change things as they are?
And when you have one of those confusing yes means this and no means that, yeah, when you're explaining it, it's probably gone down. Carla, your thoughts on the cash bail?
I don't have too much to add. I think obviously the argument is that the cash bail system has created two systems of justice in California, and one which disproportionately affects poor people and people of color, which is why the NAACP's position on this one is kind of head scratching. But yeah, you're right. I think this is going to confuse the voters, as you said, Lonnie. A yes vote does abolish the cash bail system. A no vote keeps the cash bail system. That's going to be an issue, I think, for voters who aren't going to be able to make heads or tails of this one. But that whole drive to eliminate cash bail has been part of a conversation nationally on the issue of criminal justice reform, police reform, and just reform of the justice system to provide a more even playing field for people of color. So that's where this one comes down.
John, could I add one point here?
Sure.
The head scratcher that Carla refers to has to do with the NAACP endorsing positions that would seem to be antithetical to their values. I think it's of note that the head of the California NAACP has a PR firm. That PR firm was given, I believe it was a $1.2 million contract to promote 5 positions on, I think, 5 of the state initiatives. Some might consider this a conflict of interest. And that may be why you see that organization, and there are others like it, by the way, who just don't get the notoriety, taking positions that would seem to be adverse to their own values.
Okay. We survived the propositions. All you have to do now is fill out your form and get it into the election authorities. Let's talk about, in our remaining time, let's talk about some other issues on the election scene. Tonight, I believe it's in Utah, the vice presidential candidates, Vice President Mike Pence and Senator Kamala Harris, will be debating. And Lonnie, I think you're a veteran of national campaigns. Yeah. So what do you think each candidate needs to accomplish tonight?
Well, there's the old saying that I forgot who said it, maybe Larry or Carl, remember that the vice presidency is not worth a warm bucket of spit. And, generally speaking, that's the case. Although this year, given the president's COVID diagnosis, given Joe Biden's relatively more advanced age, the vice presidential debate takes on a more important dimension. I think, look, I was one of the folks preparing Paul Ryan for his debate in 2012 when he was the VP nominee against Joe Biden. And, really the VP debate is usually an opportunity to continue to go on the attack, to make sure the message of the campaign is one that's articulated well, and to not screw things up. Those are generally the goals. This year, I think it'll be interesting. People will watch Kamala Harris a little bit more carefully because they don't know, in California, we've had exposure to her, but nationally, I think her unknowns are still relatively high. A lot of voters say, I don't know much about Kamala Harris. This may be their first introduction to her really on a national stage, even though she did all those primary debates. This is a different stage, a different opportunity. So I think for her, the stakes are high to be able to demonstrate competency, to be able to demonstrate what her perspective is. And look, I think she'll get pushed a little bit on areas where she and Biden disagree, particularly healthcare. She has embraced Medicare for all in the past. She's since rescinded her support of that. She had a relatively tortured answer on healthcare during the primary. We'll see if she's able to recover on that issue. Areas that she's divided with Biden as well. I think, those will get areas of exploration, certainly, that the moderator will probe. And then for Pence, I think he's going to get pressed really hard on COVID response and the administration's response in light of the president himself contracting COVID and a bunch of people working in the White House contracting COVID. So this debate tonight actually is a lot more interesting than any past VP debate, although past VP debates have had great moments. I'll just mention one, which was the Lloyd Benson debate against Dan Quayle when they had the exchange about John F. Kennedy, and Benson with the famous line, Senator Quayle, I knew Jack Kennedy, you're no Jack Kennedy. That was from a VP debate. So we'll see what happens tonight, but a lot more people are going to be watching with interest.
Larry, I think a lot of folks coming at this debate are kind of, especially from California, again, where we know her, are kind of thinking, wow, this is Kamala Harris. She's going to, she's a prosecutor. She's going to be really sharp. But Mike Pence has also done a lot of debating in his races for Congress and governor and for vice president now. What do you, if there's going to be any surprises tonight, where do you think they would be? And are they likely to be gaffes, or are they likely to be someone really scores a policy point?
If there's a surprise, it'll be because something wasn't done. You're right. This is Kamala Harris's coming out party, so to speak. But there's a reason this is so important, and that is there'll be 3 to 4 times the number of people watching tonight as there were any singular of the Democratic debates. So the exposure opportunities here are massive for her. Now, Pence has, of course, exposure opportunities and has had them for some time. Unfortunately for Vice President Pence, he is the head of the COVID task force. And I absolutely believe that whatever else, COVID is the issue of this election. I think Biden's been very skillful about that. I think Harris will be too. And Pence has got to find some way to get himself out of a box that he has put himself in, or was put in by the president, to take your choice. Harris has to be careful, though, because Lonnie says there were divisions here among the two, Biden and Harris. So Harris is going to have to tap dance on that. You're talking about a 10 to 16 point national lead right now. Take a look at all the national polls, respect the national polls. That's pretty hard to shake up. All right, it can be shaken up. The question is, will this debate do it? I don't think so.
Carla, your thoughts?
I mean, this is one of the most consequential vice presidential debates because of the age of the presidential candidates. They're both in their mid-70s. And, Pence has a real challenge. He has to defend the last 4 years. Remember, the last time he did this debate with Tim Kaine, he was introducing Mr. Art of the Deal to America as this fresh-faced business guy who could get things done. Tonight, he has to defend the president's record and even over the last 48 hours, the balcony scene, the way it was handled, the coming back out of Walter Reed, he's got to defend all that. Even the president pulling out of the COVID stimulus negotiations and sending the market tanking, and then turning around on Twitter last night among 65 Twitter tweets and going in another direction. Pence has been very skillful in being able to, manage the president's misstatements, and that is going to be his challenge tonight. But I think Harris too. She has a very high bar. The goals right now are a lot for her, and I think a lot of people may be underestimating Mike Pence going into this. But she has to prosecute the case. She is a prosecutor, has to prosecute that case for Joe Biden. But she's going to get those questions about, are you going to pack the courts? What about states for rights for D.C. and Puerto Rico? The questions that Biden hasn't answered yet, she's going to be put on the dime to answer those questions. So she better be ready for that, as well as defunding the police, the Green New Deal, et cetera. Those are the areas that Republicans think she's weakest on. It's going to be a really interesting debate.
Well, we've only got a few more minutes left. Let's actually go off on one of those issues you just mentioned, which is the Supreme Court. Of course, right upon the death of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, President Trump moved quickly to nominate Amy Coney Barrett to the court. Needless to say, this has been controversial on both sides. So, start with you, Carla. Briefly, what do you think of this fight and its possible impact on the control of the Senate?
I mean, it's fascinating to see, and I think we have yet to see if any of other senators may be affected by COVID. The numbers that may define how this plays out. But what we know is, the polls show Americans are against really rushing these confirmation hearings. And I think this is another place where the Trump administration's handling of the pandemic comes front and center. When you have some of the senators saying they're going to appear in moon suits to make sure this confirmation hearing happens. That and the fact that As Trump has tweeted several times and talked about, he believes the courts are going to have sort of a definitive answer on the outcome of the election, or could have. That makes this even more dramatic. So considering the fact that it was her event at the White House that turned out to be the super spreader event here, all of this comes together in one of the, I think, the most dramatic confirmation hearings ever at this point.
If this were an episode of West Wing, they'd be telling their writers, no, you're packing it too much. No one will believe all this stuff is happening. Lanhee, is this the political win for the Republicans? And I'm hearing that some Republicans are saying this is worth losing the Senate for, because this really ensures conservative hegemony on the court.
Yeah, I don't know that. I think the argument I've heard is actually the way it helps is in some Senate races, reminding people kind of why they might support Republican candidates. And I think for the Trump administration, the hope is the same, that some of those we talked about earlier, some of those uncomfortable, undecided voters, the reason that they might end up pulling the lever for Trump is to say, well, look, at least he sort of gives us what we would like, which is a more conservative Supreme Court. I mean, it's just tough to see how this all plays out politically, except to say that I think Democrats need to be a little bit cautious here about what they're attacking. In other words, attacking the process is one thing where I think they will see some traction. The idea that the new president, whoever it is, should be the one to make the nomination and that process. And then attacking Amy Coney Barrett separately, because I think she represents a lot of very favorable things, quite frankly. I think she's got a great she's clearly qualified. She's got a background for being on the court. You can disagree with her decisions, but she is clearly qualified as an appointee in that way. And so there will be a fine line in my mind between attacking her and attacking the process that's been used. And you see Democrats trying to pivot to talking about health care, the Obamacare case that will be before the court on November the 10th. You hear them talking about other issues as well, voting rights, et cetera. That's where the Democrats want the conversation to go. That is more fruitful territory than trying to attack Barrett. I've seen some attacking her for her adoptions, which I think is probably not going to be fruitful and not going to get them a lot of points with swing voters. But I think there are more fruitful avenues that they ought to pursue if that's their goal.
Larry, what are your thoughts? And are the Democrats powerless on this?
And there's an old saying in politics: if you got the power, use it. And nobody knows how to use power in politics better than Mitch McConnell. He's going to get this through. It may not be before the election, simply because of what Carla said, and that is too many wounds from COVID-19, which is ironic in itself among the Republican senators. But if not before the election, it'll be after the election. Democrats can poo-poo this all they want. It's not fair. The court's going to be too conservative. I would just remind them that if you were around in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you had an incredibly liberal Supreme Court, which was probably out of sync with the public to the extent that the conservative Supreme Court is going to be out of sync with the public now. Elections have consequences. That's the other saying. And this is the consequence that goes back 4 years. Three times the president's been able to appoint a justice. And whatever you want to say about President Trump, and we can say a lot, he has lived up to his promise. I promised you I was going to give you conservative justices. I'm giving them to you. And maybe to Lanhee's point, a few people will go ahead and say, okay, I can't stand the guy, but he gave me my judges. Okay. And that may be the difference in a couple of close elections. But this is done. It's going to happen. And, it's all part of politics. And I'd be shocked if it didn't go through.
Okay. Well, on that note, we're going to move on, and thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. One final note: Californians have begun to receive their ballots and have even cast their votes in some cases. So wherever you are, whatever your politics and election favorites that you want to see win, whatever those are, we urge you to make sure you're registered and to make sure you vote. Thank you to our great panel today, Carla Marinucci, Dr. Larry Gersten, and Dr. Lanhee Chen. Thank you to our partners at the Silicon Valley Capital Club. And thanks to all of you who are watching us and listening to us online. Stay safe and healthy, and have a good week.